All right. Good afternoon, everyone. Just going to let people continue to trickle in, but thanks for joining us for our second town hall. We're some amazing people here today, but just a quick intro. Nicole and I are here from the Concept Art Association. We run an advocacy organization for artists working in entertainment. We like to listen to the concerns of the community. This is a concern that's come up in a number of ways from our community. So we wanted to hold space to be able to have these conversations, which is what we're doing right now. If we've disabled chat today, there will be the opportunity for Q&A at the last 30 minutes. We're slated to be here for 2 hours. You can send those direct messages to Nicole, Concept Art Association, Nicole Hendricks. All those questions will go there, and then we'll answer as many as we can in the last 30 minutes. And yeah, with that being said, I'm going to kick it over to Carla, who's going to just do a little introduction for those of you that maybe are somehow new to this topic. But this is a little refresher and kind of the current state of what our understanding is for this issue. Carla.
Hi, everybody. Well, first and foremost, thank you so much, Concept Art Association, for giving us this time and this space to have these conversations. And thank you so much to all the panelists who are also just as generous with their time and expertise. We will get to introducing each panelist shortly, but first, I would like to share with you all a quick little presentation concerning AI and concerning kind of the state where we're at right now. I think a lot of you who've attended our first particular town hall will see a lot of the same recurring themes, but we want to make sure that we allow ourselves to have this conversation, first knowing fully well how these tools work, what's the concerns now, and updates on some of the information now that we have, since our first conversation was mostly a big question mark of what is this. Now that we have a little bit more information at hand, we can start to kind of really poke around and see more of what this actually is. So let me just adjust a couple things on my screen really here, and let's get started. So we'll start with our basic outline, what to expect from this town hall. This is the brief introduction series. We're then going to open it up to panelist introduction and then a panelist discussion. This particular town hall will be asking some questions of our panelists, but it's overall an open conversation between all of our guests here, as they all have incredible insight in all of this, both from the experience of what it's like to be on the end of a AI, generated image, what it's like to, understand these models and really from a researcher's point of view, and on a more from the Copyright Office, what are their thoughts on all this? We'll have, of course, our 30-minute Q&A, as Rachel mentioned, and then we'll end up in a closing. So just to kind of give us back a little bit of an overview of what these tools are and what they're producing again. Basically, AI models are able to generate media in a matter of seconds. We'll go through the process of that a little bit more intensely in a second, but I did wanted to show really quickly where some of these models are at. A quick note, some of these are a little bit old. They're actually from our first meetup. So this is now September, which is actually ancient with how fast some of these tools are. But it's still enough to give us a good overview of what it is that AI generated media can look like. It can replicate a lot of different styles and a lot of different looks. It can generate things, spaces, environments in second. It can do styles from your favorite movies and so on, but it can also generate likenesses of people. It can generate things that feel like feel like a specific artist created it. So there's a lot of issues, to discuss. But first, how does it work? We're going to break it down based on a video that came out not too long ago from box.com, where they kind of break it down each step in a specific way. I highly recommend everybody. The video is called The AI That Creates Any Picture You Want. And again, it is also kind of outdated, but it breaks down the processes really well. But let's do that here. So first, it all starts with, a data set. What is a data set? Data set is when images and descriptions across the internet are gathered and taken by a practice called data mining or data scraping. Sometimes this this practice is painstakingly curated by hand. Other times it's done in large quantities by bots. When it's done via bots, it's really impossible to curate its content, which can include anywhere from pornography, copyrighted data, private data, all kinds of really problematic things end up in those data sets. But this technique of data scraping allows either AI or machine learning models companies to create data sets, and which in turn are used to train the AI machine learning models. Basically, when you give a prompt, the AI then searches a database for imagery and text descriptions, finding commonalities within the prompts given. Once we're done with the data sets, gathered all the data, it then moves on to a next stage called deep learning. And as the AI models gather data, it starts to kind of find commonalities between text descriptions and images. It will associate descriptions and images together, like, for example, banana equals to color yellow, banana equals fruit, banana also equals to crescent shape. As it continues to make these associations between description tags, images, and prompts, it creates basically a deep web of associations, increasing what I'd like to call its visual vocabulary. Followed right up is called the latent space. So the latent space is basically a representation of compressed data in which similar points are closer to each other in space. Oh, give me just a second. One of my notes went all over the place. There's a lot of information here, so I need my notes, y'all. I am not an engineer. That's Avi. Anyhow, basically, this is where all the connections, associations, and lessons the AI has learned is gathered and compressed. This is why Midjourney looks a little bit different from DALL-E and so on. But, for now. Next up is the generation process. So the AI, after it's trained with its data sets, deep learning, compressed all that into its latent state, begins to a process of breaking down the data into diffuse bits. Slowly, it reintegrates different key components of data together to create an image based on unique prompts given. There are many generation processes, but the most commonly utilized is one called diffusion. Some experts consider this a very advanced photo mixer. Sometimes it just, depending on who you ask as well, someone will say it doesn't even generate new work, but only creates derivations based on statistical probability. That one's still yet to be quite defined. And of course, last but not least, is the output. So all of these processes generate a final image or output. In most AI models, a variety of imagery is given, and a user can ask different variations based on the preferred result, and the entire cycle begins anew. This whole process can take anywhere from like seconds to a minute, depending on your hard drive and the hard drive of the companies and GPUs. Sorry, apologies, Abby, depending on the GPUs. So we have so many questions and concerns for each of these processes. I'm going to kind of raise a couple questions or our concerns in this. For example, in the data set, massive data sets such as Lion 5B is utilized by Stability AI, well, funded as well. We'll get to that in a second, contains about 5.8 billion images. And that data set is littered with copyright works and private data. This data was acquired by, kind of weird, not so great practice that technologist Andy Bio calls data laundering. And it's basically where a company builds data sets under the pretext of research to then use for commercial purposes. We'll talk about this particular issue in a bit. Developers in the space have ignored public domain works. I don't know why, but it's kind of frustrating because they're right there. Golden Age illustrators are in the public domain, so like there's some good stuff in there. And another thing that we're concerned about is that AI companies have claimed a lot of data that really shouldn't be there. So it's just like copyrighted data or private data, and was done so without anyone's knowledge, consent, permission, or potential ability to opt out. More on that later. Our concerns for deep learning are, well, data companies, like Stability AI and Midjourney, have large quantities of copyrighted and private data learned through associations the model make. So inevitably, those learned associations do contain copyrighted and private data. Another issue that we have is that due to the process of machine learning, once a model has been trained, it cannot forget. And then it kind of, brings up the question, like, can an AI unlearn? And let's say later on we find out, oh, they use this data that they aren't allowed to. Can we take it out? And right now, well, we'll ask Gabi, but as of yet, that's very difficult. Have very similar concerns and issues and questions that we had from deep learning as in the latent space, basically like because the learned associations it makes contains copyrighted and private data, like, do the models inevitably contain that, copyrighted and private data? Can it forget, and can it forget if we find data that needs to be out there? And for the concerns of the generation process, we have seen generations that do end up having copyrighted material that is identical to its original source. We'll show some examples on that in a second too. Hey. But one of the things that is curious and concerning is that we don't have to make the case anymore of, does this copy? Because Stability AI itself has claimed, and I quote, because diffusion models are prone to memorization and overfitting, releasing a model trained on copyrighted data could potentially result in legal issues. Stability AI is talking about their new audio model, Dance Diffusion, and explaining to users why Dance Diffusion datasets do not contain copyrighted material. They gave no such, they gave us no such consideration when it came to the visual models. And for the output, there's so many questions in here too, and concerns, since the AI companies themselves agree that generated results tend to copy original data, including copyrighted data and private data, what does that mean when something is generated? The US Copyright Office, hi guys, themselves have claimed that, AI models cannot claim copyright. Companies do grant commercial licenses for generated images, even though it utilizes this quote unquote tainted data, copyrighted data, private data. Sometimes it's considered tainted data. For more popular artists like Tchaikovsky, hi Greg, there's so many AI generated images and AI generated images in his name that when you do search in either social media or search engines, the results now contain AI generated imagery. Can this affect our ability to advertise and promote work? Can this affect our identity? What are the potentials for identity theft, fraud? There's a lot of real concerns and questions here. Now, let's take a step back and take a quick look at the companies that are currently out there. These are the major ones. I know there's like a bunch of other ones, but these are the ones on everybody's focus. Midjourney, based in the US, OpenAI, which has DALL-E 2 in the US, and Stability AI, which uses Stable Diffusion, Dream Stable Diffusion, and so on, Dream Studio, and so on in the UK and US. They important to note that all these companies do profit from all of this, as they each have like profit models or business models. For Midjourney, they do a membership kind of model where they charge users a monthly fee, sometimes a yearly fee depending on if it's a corporate user. OpenAI and Stability AI have similar models where they charge you per generation or per number of generations is every time you create or you ask the computer to generate a new image. And they all kind of, have their own different structures. Of course, going back onto the data sets, what are about the data sets of each of these companies? Midjourney has been a little bit private about it, but has admitted in the past to have used one subset of the Lion data set. It's one of their earlier iterations called Lion 400, which does still contain copyrighted data and private data. But one of the things that you can usually tell whether their data sets contain copyrighted data or private data is whether you can get likenesses in either celebrities or other artists and so on. And that's something you can definitely do in Midjourney. DALL-E in particular we have had no understanding what is in their data sets. As of yet, you cannot do artist work replicas or celebrity likenesses. However, OpenAI is right now in a little bit of an issue, as Microsoft and OpenAI has created an AI based on people's licensed code on GitHub. It's called GitHub Copilot, and it has been in the news as concerning. So we don't know what OpenAI is up to. Stability AI in particular is their data set that they used and node funded is Lion 5B. Lion 5B stands for 5.6 billion text and image data. And they 100% allow you to do artwork and celebrity likeness. And you can view that data set, and it's entirely online. There's been a lot of reporting that has happened on this data set, and we'll definitely get to that in just a second. But again, it's also important to remember that all of these companies grant their users commercial rights. And that's important to note because each company, terms of services is a little bit different, but basically, they do allow the use of generated images for commercial purposes, which is odd considering that generated images cannot be copyright data or private data guaranteed free. Now, let's take a step back from the process, how these companies operate, and talk a little bit more about what we've learned throughout these months and what are our current concerns. So one of the things that we found out to be particularly troubling or particularly concerning on our end is finding out that Stability AI basically funded a nonprofit and helped fund Lion, which is the data set. And Stability AI was quoted as one of a very important source of funding for this. Well, this allowed Lion as a nonprofit research database or data set to contain copyright data and private data because it's for research, and that's legally fine. And I think that's fine. However, Stability AI then turned around to use that non-commercial data set for commercial purposes. It's important to know that, again, Lion is utilized by Stable Diffusion, Dream Studio, Midjourney, and potentially Google as well. And this is a practice that actually happens a lot more than I like that I'd like. And I'm sure Abhishek can speak more on this. Another concern, artists' works and full names are used without their knowledge or permission. This is a pretty big privacy concern, in my opinion, as all of this is going on without anyone's knowledge, anyone's consent or permission, especially concerning as AI, so cannot forget. It also shows us the potential to copy. Here's an example I like to show people, and I like to call that the Bloodborne example. So on the left, you'll see Bloodborne marketing material. This is used for the PlayStation 4. Is that released in 2015? The 2015 release of the video game Bloodborne, which is really fun. On the right, you have a search through a database or a search engine that allows you to look through stable diffusion generated imagery. And when you type Bloodborne, you'll notice that you'll get almost an exact replica of the original marketing material. So we are shown that these models can copy to a level that's very, very, very close. There are other potential privacy issues. Ars Technica recently reported that private medical record photos were found in popular AI training dataset Lion. Vice has even found really concerning things like ISIS executions, non-consensual porn, child porn. A lot of really weird stuff is in this data set. There's also, tons and tons of people there, a lot of celebrities in there. They have also other privacy concerns. Midjourney community has compiled massive database full of artists alongside with their full names. A lot of them, if not most of them, are there without their knowledge, permission, or consent. And even recently, we saw a case where a Redditor utilized Stable Diffusion Dream Booth to train an AI with just 32 works of a specific illustrator and then be able to generate artwork that is specifically intended to be like that illustrator. In this particular case was Holly Mangard. I hope I'm saying her last name right. Apologies. More again, remember, currently there's no way for machine learning or AI models to forget, so there's no real way to opt out. And this is one of the concerns that we have because of the associations that the AI model makes. Let's say a company can implement a very quick prompt block list. Do not use this person's name. However, because of machine learning and associations, let's say we use my work, for example, you could say Carlo Ortiz, but the machine could also associate my name with oil painting. I mean, my name and my work with oil painting, with illustration, with concept art. And as it generates a new batch of work, it can use my work whether I want it or not, whether there's block list or not. This is a huge, huge issue that I'm sure Abhishek will be able to shed more light with us. And of course, there's the question, because the Copyright Office is here. Hi, what about the copyright? Well, there's a lot of questions here too. Recently, the US Copyright Office ruled that AI art cannot be copyrighted because AI artificial intelligence lacked human authorship, but also AI artists are trying to gain copyright. Recently, there was an artist that tried, or not an AI artist, but a user tried to basically find copyright registration for a comic book that they did. This, if I'm not mistaken, the update on the story is that user was actually denied that registration, but it's happening, and there's already chatter in the in the forums to not be so open about whether it is AI generated or not. And of course, again, to reiterate, Stability AI themselves have argued that their models are prone to memorization and overfitting. I'm sure Avishek can give us a little bit more insight on what overfitting means, but generally overfitting means that something is generated close to its data source. So basically it has the potential to copy. So these companies have already agreed on this. There's a lot of questions here. It's like, what is fair use? How does the US Copyright Office evaluate fair use? Does it matter if non-commercial data sets are used commercially? Is there infringement? Can AI unlearn? And so many more questions. And with that in mind, let's open it to the floor. I don't want to take up any more space than we need to. So let's open it to the floor and let's start that conversation. But before we get really deep into it, why doesn't the panel go ahead and introduce themselves? And we'll start with Mark. How about you, Mark?
Hi, everyone. My name is Mark Gray. I'm an attorney at the United States Copyright Office within our Office of General Counsel. So we do a lot of the legal and regulatory work within the Copyright Office, including reviewing registrations. So I do have some experience with this area.
Andrew, you can go next too.
Hey there, I'm Andrew Foglia. I'm also an attorney with the U.S. Copyright Office. I'm in our Office of Policy and International Affairs, where we monitor copyright developments around the globe and advise Congress on policy and provide technical advice on legislation.
Abhishek.
Hey everyone, I guess I'm the resident AI nerd here. Just joking. I'm the founder and principal researcher at the Montreal AI Ethics Institute, an international nonprofit research institute with a mission to democratize AI ethics literacy. I also serve as a senior responsible AI leader and expert at the Boston Consulting Group, where my work focuses on helping organizations implement responsible AI in practice. And so that typically takes the form of policy, technical, and organizational governance measures. Prior to this, I used to work as a machine learning engineer at Microsoft, so building these systems. So yeah, one might say that I spend a bit of time doing AI.
Thank you. Then next up, Greg.
Hey everyone, my name is Greg Rutkowski and I'm an illustrator and concept artist. I'm working in the digital industry for about 14 years, but I have digital and traditional background. So whether it's digital art or traditional art, I can still share my thoughts about it. So
Very good. I'm Carla. Just to reiterate too, I guess I should introduce myself too. My name is Carla Ortiz. I am an artist, concept artist, and fine artist. I've been working in the film industry for a while now. I've worked in projects such as Black Panther, Thor Ragnarok, Loki, but most notably known for my work in Doctor Strange as the designer of Doctor Strange, the first movie, not the second one. That was wonderfully, they did great too. Nicole, Rachel, I'm sure the Concept Art Association already said who they were, so we can get started.
I think we can get started.
All right.
I would, because the thing that's kind of gathered us here today is how is this affecting artists? And I think it'd be really great to start with Greg. Just fill us in on what has your experience been with the AI models?
Everything started 2 or 3 months ago when I started to receive a lot of messages from my fans or people. They were sending me messages about the fact that my name was being used in this AI generators. And that was really new for me back then. And I was just digging through the internet, what's going on and what it is basically. And after a while, I just discovered that's, most of the generated images are signed by my name. And that was really weird because whenever my name popped out on the internet, before the AI, it was more condensed into sharing my works or let's say whenever my work was just shared on some more popular website, it was always connected to my works. My name was always connected to my works. not counting like similarity in my name basically. But yeah, and that was like a really hard experience for me, because I realized that it was spreading so much. Like the results that I typed in when I typed my name into the Google, there was so many results not really associated with my works. So there was like let's say fake works of signed by my name, and basically that was like the very first thing. And then there was like the whole thing with Reddit. Like people started to commenting how do I feel about it, and I started to, and back then I contacted, or Carla contacted with me, and we started to talk about it. Like because my feelings about it was always more towards concerns than just hype that this is really great technology. So my very first concern was, okay, is it like ethically or morally correct, because still to this day I'm not really sure, and I think we all have questions about it, although probably there are some topics that are really clear for some of us, especially guys from Copyright Office. So yeah, I'm still like really shocked by this, and the whole mental health issues with that is like crazy. Like waiting for any topic on Twitter or Reddit about my name, or about memes about AI technology and works of any artist, is like, just for me is I'm not really I'm not really sort of the AI is just for me really shady right now.
With regards to that, the amount of work that's now out there in the world that people are like, is this really Greg? Is this an AI kind of Greg piece of art? Kind of good to have the Copyright Office weigh in on this concept of like authorship, and like how that, like as it stands currently, like how is that viewed within the Copyright Office? Like people putting artwork out in the world that kind of, it has Greg's style or his name, like where is the current state of that within US copyright? And I know that Greg is not in the US, but let's use Greg as an example for the US, and then I guess Andrew can probably weigh in internationally with that as well.
Sure.
Mark?
So I'll just say, as a framing matter, from our perspective, there are at least two major issues with AI and copyright, or areas where they intersect. The first is the authorship question of when an AI can be an author, and that one Mark is more the most expert we have. So I'll let him speak to that. And the second is the question of the use of copyrighted works in training data, which I can speak about a little later. But I'll pass it off to Mark now to talk about the authorship question.
Sure. Yeah, and there's sort of several questions embedded in that. So maybe to step back for a second. So for those of you who are fortunately not as familiar with copyright law and have not gone as much in the weeds as Andrew and I have. So copyright law, the way the law is actually written is it protects what are called works of authorship. Like that's the phrase it uses, works of authorship. And traditionally, the way we've interpreted that is to assume that there has to be an author, and that author has to be a human of some sort. So if you remember from a few years ago, there was a case about a monkey that took a selfie photo. Monkeys are not people, therefore they are not authors, therefore they do not create copyrighted works of authorship. And so the AI question essentially is sort of a new flavor of that, where, in the past, new technological advances have always sort of stretched the boundaries of what gets protected by copyright and what does not get protected by copyright. So there's an old case from the Supreme Court about 100 years ago when the first cameras started coming out. There was a real live question about, if you're just pressing a button, did you make anything or did the camera do all the work? And so there's a case that went up to the Supreme Court involving, I think, a photo of Oscar Wilde. And the court said, well, yes, the camera is doing a lot of the work, but there's a photographer who's deciding where does the camera go? How much light should be in there? Where should there be additional light sources, shadows? There's all these creative decisions made by a human that gets embedded into a photograph. And so, photographs are works of humans, works of authors, even though they're using a tool to get to that end result. And so the question around AI essentially is, when is, or in what situations is the AI acting as a tool where there's a human who is controlling what is coming out? And when is the AI just sort of, acting as the monkey that took the selfie that the human was not involved in? And so, for some AI systems, there's a case that I think you guys brought up where someone tried to register a work where they said it was entirely generated by the AI. They disclaimed any involvement, any work. And so if there's no human involvement, our view is that the statute says there has to be an author. And if there's not an author who's a human, the copyright law does not apply to it. And so that's sort of the baseline example of when AI works are copyrightable. The questions get more complicated the more involved a human is. So like the text prompt example, that's a bit of a different situation than just there's a machine that's generating things that you have no control over.
I'll add one copyright doctrine that might be relevant to text generation, but it's, again, a very large gray area. So we have what's called the idea-expression dichotomy. Your expression is copyrightable, your original expression, but your idea is not. So you might have the idea of a story where the Prince of Denmark his dad is dead and he thinks his uncle murdered his dad. That idea is not copyrightable, but if hypothetically you were to write Hamlet and it hadn't already been written, that would be copyrightable. Now, where in the stage between the idea and the actual full text of Hamlet you get to a copyrightable expression, there are some subtle areas where it would be difficult to say where you've crossed that boundary. And it's the same issue with AI. So with text prompts, for example, if I type into like Dolly, for example, underwater cityscape, and then it paints me a picture of an underwater cityscape, I would argue, at least there is an argument that all I've contributed here is an idea that's not copyrightable. If you start giving extremely specific instructions, or you have a tool that requires an enormous level of detail, you might end up with a more complicated question. So I'll also add on the international side, most countries have sort of the same view of authorship that the US Copyright Office does. They require human authorship. There are a few exceptions. The UK is the most notable, where they have a special 50-year term of protection for machine-generated works. The UK ran a consultation on artificial intelligence over the last year, and they've so far decided to stick with that. Their view is basically, as far as we can tell, this is not our particular term here is not causing harm. So we'll revisit the question if we see that there's any harm here. But everybody else and New Zealand has a similar term, but they don't look at it the same way. Otherwise, the US is very much in the mainstream on the authorship question.
I have a follow-up question to that. It's a very, very interesting kind of almost legal debate. Let's say, and if I'm not mistaken, Abhishek can see if it's true or not. One of the things that I've noticed, or one of the things that the models kind of fail, is that the more detailed it is, the less good the generated results are. So, but then the other question to that is, like, one of the more popular things that people add in their prompts are artist names. Like, if someone manages to copyright an artist name, like, what is that a thing? I'm like, huh? Sorry if that seems too.
So just two background rules. The artist's name would not be copyrightable, nor are styles generally copyrightable. So we can talk about this a bit later, but for example, you mentioned, like, your presentation included that Redditor who had trained an AI to mimic the style of a particular artist. On the output question, I'll separate that from the training question, the question of copying at the training stage. On the output side, the mere fact that those pictures have the recognizable style of those artists would not necessarily make them infringing. If, however, you might, end up in a case like the Bloodborne example, where the output actually is just the same image again, or close enough to it that we would call it substantially similar, and you might have an infringement issue in that case. But yes, it's rather complicated.
Yeah, So go ahead.
Oh, if I can jump in on that, actually. So that's sort of the broad strokes. I will point out, I mean, when we talk about the style of an artist, so copyright law protects essentially you copying a specific work. That might be an image, that might be a movie, that might be a song. It protects you from copying a specific thing. So typically when we talk about infringement, we mean that you are reproducing at least a big enough chunk of that thing to be breaking the law. Style in some ways is a shorthand for common ways artists create art, commonalities between different works they've created. And so if your style is, a particular hand pose of a certain color in a certain depiction, you could actually imagine that works in that style that have not been created before could still be considered in the eyes of copyright law infringing, because that element shows up in enough specific works that you can classify it as infringing. There's some nuance around there. For example, we have a concept of character copyright. So Batman is not just one Batman comic book. He's a bunch of different versions of Batman and a bunch of different movies and comic books. But in general, there is some level of style appropriation that would hit the infringement side of the copyright law line. But there's also other elements where if it just has the same kind of vibe, that may not be specific enough to actually trigger, a one-to-one match between something that's been created by that artist.
Thank you.
And sorry, can I jump in and just cross ask a question, because I think this is very it's great that we have copyright experts here, right? So when we're talking about where things fall, when you're talking about infringement in terms of the elements of style, is that then judged on a case-by-case basis as people file claims, or how does that sort of process unroll?
Sure, yeah. So infringement is what we call a fact question. You usually have to take it to a jury if it's questionable enough. So to break it back down, so copyright infringement, we typically divide into two kind of pieces. The first part is that you have to have access to the thing that you copied. Like if I create, theoretically at least, if I create a song that sounds exactly like a Beatles song, but I've lived in the woods and I've never heard the Beatles, it's hard to say that I copied the Beatles. I just happened to come up with it on my own. In practice, that doesn't really happen. But often, theoretically, you have to have access to something before you can copy it. And the second part, as Andrew mentioned, is substantial similarity. At least some part of the copyrighted work has been used in what you've done. You don't have to copy a full song. If you copy 30 seconds, that 30 seconds is the same. But in general, there has to be both access to the thing being copied and then some sort of overlap or some similarity between what is copyrighted and what you've done as the alleged infringer. And so that's going to be a case-by-case question. You might make a song you might make one song that doesn't sound like a prior song, and then maybe you tweak that song and it sounds more like the prior song. It really is going to be a case-by-case question.
That's very, very good. I'm just I'm going to have to internalize that. Goodness. Sorry, I'm just lift a little flower, guys. That's very good information to have. Thank you, Mark. So I did want to ask, and we'll keep the focus just a little bit on Mark and Andrew for now. We'll get back to Greg and Abby as well. But we are aware that the office has fair use database that contains case law to help us better understand fair use. What are other resources that artists can look to other than getting a lawyer for better understanding fair use and when it does and doesn't apply? Basically, how do we help artists to better understand this? what resources outside of getting a fancy
It's a really
lawyer?
good question, and I'm sure we would be very interested to hear what sort of resources artists are interested in, what they would find helpful. Our fair use database actually is probably one of our best tools for that. Let me back up for a moment and just sort of introduce fair use and also frame where fair use enters this entire question. So as the presentation mentions, in order to train all these AI systems, you have to give them a massive amount of data. Some of that data you give them may be copyrighted. In the process of training them, you're going to be making copies of those copyrighted works. So that is theoretically infringing copyright infringement.
Mm-hmm.
So different countries have different ways of handling this. In the EU, for example, they have a text and data mining exception. Japan has a text and data mining exception. Singapore has a text and data mining exception. The UK has a text and data mining exception. And these work the EU's works differently from the way the UK's does, which works, and Singapore's also works differently from the EU. The EU, for example, just very broad strokes, one of their 2 exceptions has an opt-out requirement. The general exception that like people would be using, non-like research institutions for commercial use, there's an opt-out where artists can theoretically I say, because I don't know how this works in practice yet, I don't think anybody does, they can say, I don't want my data to be in this, to be allowed to be used in training models. So in the US, we do not have a statutory text and data mining exception. What we have is fair use. So fair use, as was teed up earlier, is a doctrine that helps determine where circumstances in which you are using a work, but your use of that work is okay, notwithstanding the absence of a license. And in the US, it's a 4-factor test, a 4-factor non-exclusive test. There are other things you can consider, but those 4 factors are, broadly speaking, the purpose and character of your use, the nature of the copyrighted work you're copying, the amount and substantiality of the work you're using, and market harm. Again, those very broad strokes. It is, as with the infringer test, a fact-specific test. So it's not really possible for us to say broadly, all text and data mining is going to be fair use, or all text and data mining is not going to be fair use. The other thing is, we don't have, at this point, developed case law on machine learning, and certainly not machine learning in this context. One of the major reference points for us in the case law is that researchers rely on is the Google Books litigation, but that involved the mass digitization of books, essentially the creation of a digital library of Alexandria. And the court said, this is transformative. They're making this a searchable index so that you can provide a snippet view. And while there are certain analogies between that and text and data mining generally, it's not direct. And because fair use is fact specific, it doesn't answer the question. So I will say from the Copyright Office point of view, we can't give a direct answer to, as a general matter, whether this sort of text and data mining is fair use. And even in specifics, we don't have case law on a lot of these uses yet.
Could I ask a follow-up question? What constitutes market harm? If you're unable to totally get there.
Yeah. So again, it's fact specific. So you it's not something where I can give a always a straight up answer. I can give you analogies. So just off the top of my head, if there was a case where Gerald Ford had an autobiography coming out where he was going to talk about, among other things, his decision to pardon Richard Nixon. And he had the book coming out, and just before the book comes out, a magazine gets a hold of the final print version and decides to basically, hey, we're going to run the most interesting parts of this book right before the book is published.
Rude.
And there's no question it was newsworthy and all that, but the court was concerned, among other things, that this could cause direct harm to the market, because in that case, I think there actually was proof that a particular licensing agreement that a different magazine had paid to get the first shot at printing this material, that license was immediately worthless for them. So sometimes there is actually a clear hey, I had a deal and now nobody's going to pay me for this thing. Other times it's much more diffuse, and I should say market harm is not, none of the factors are definitive. They all have to be balanced together. They all have to be considered together. For example, there are things like parodies, where if let's say I absolutely detest I don't know, Taylor Swift for some reason. I don't, but let's say I do. And I want to write a parody song that just in my view, illustrates the ways in which Taylor's songwriting has become rote and kind of pitiful, or making fun of the production style. And again, not my view, but let's say I did. It may be that I go out there and say, yeah, I actually intend to hurt her market. I want her sales to suffer because I'm showing so that she's a hack. That's not going to lose me a fair use case because I have necessarily because I have other arguments. But in general, it's a case-by-case analysis that a court would have to consider. You might, for example, with the Redditor again, who's training an AI to produce work that is like that, a specific artist. I'm not saying this is a winning argument. We don't have a record on this, but an argument someone might make, hypothetically, is that great, now this AI is directly competing with this artist who is going to pay this artist her normal fee if they can just get this AI to do it for free. It's an argument someone would make.
Would that have to be on a case? What I'm hearing is a lot of this is on a case by case basis. Like the US Copyright Office is never. It's going to be very difficult to put like a blanket statement of this AI models are, causing market harm specifically to artists in these ways. Like it's going to be on a case by case basis. In the case of like Greg, for example, where when people are going to Google search and they're typing in his name, now it's a situation where it's not always his work that's up there. Like his ability to market himself is disappearing. Like is there anything that can be done in those circumstances?
So yes, again, it would be a case by case basis. I will say once a record is built up, it is still the case that if you wanted to sue somebody for infringement, you would have to go to court and make the argument on your particular facts. In practice, there are certain doctrines we build up over time. So for example, we're fairly comfortable now saying parody is generally fair use. Now if you wanted to like make a case of a specific act being like of a specific use being parody or not parody, you'd have to go to court. But you might have less litigation over that because the parties already know, hey, this is okay, that was not okay. But in this area, as I said, it's very early. We do not have developed case law.
Thank you.
Got it. Abby, do you want to? You have your hand raised. You want to jump in?
Yeah, sorry. I have another question, and I feel like maybe I should be contributing answers rather than asking questions. But hey, it's an open space, right? Like we've got tons of questions here.
Yeah, and by the way, that also goes to the Copyright Office officers and to Greg. If anyone have any questions for other panelists, please jump in too. But go ahead, Abby.
Thank you. It's just so fascinating, right? I mean, like hearing about market harm. I was wondering, and I don't think we really touched on this explicitly, but is target and intentionality a consideration of market harm, or does it not matter? And the reason I'm asking is because I think in some places where this sort of AI generated art is being fostered or being put out rather, it might not be that, hey, I want to hurt the sales of Greg in particular. It's just that Greg's work is so great that they're just using his name to generate these images. But maybe there is no direct target or intention. So does that factor in, or does it not matter?
So as with so many fair use questions, the answer is yes and no, maybe. In general, it is not required that somebody intend to harm your market for there to be market harm, for that to weigh against fair use in the analysis. Now, there is, in theory, also a question of like, as I mentioned at the top, and I'll reiterate, those 4 factors in fair use, they're non-exclusive. The court can consider other things, and that's not to say that they always do, but like almost anything you can think of in just like a general impression, is this fair or not? A court theoretically could consider. They just are less likely to than to stick to those 4 factors. Mark, I don't know if you have anything you wanted to add there.
Yeah, so I guess sort of 2 points. So just to kind of maybe reiterate and give a little bit of context here. So fair use is purely, it is something that comes up when you get sued, right? It is a defense to infringement. And so just like infringement is kind of case by case, depending on what you've done, fair use analysis is also very case by case. And it really depends on sort of how the judge looks at what's happening and sort of the way they filter through these factors. One of the things, just in my general experience, is that how you frame the use is extremely important, right? So if you can convince a judge that the use here is, I trained an AI to replicate the style of famous artists to sell art that looks exactly like their art, you're probably not going to win that fair use case because the judge is going to find a way to rule against you. But if what you've done is you've said, I've made sort of this generalized tool that is able to pick out sort of interesting facets of style, whether that be sort of greater than normal use of contrast or uses of certain particular palettes, that might be, viewed at a different way. So it's not necessarily the intentionality of, am I specifically trying to harm Greg, but it's more just sort of, how is this system described? How is it developed? The Vox video that I think we mentioned at the beginning of this, talks about how usually when you're at least my understanding is, please correct me, Abby, is when you're building an AI system and you're deciding what to train it, you're kind of thinking about what do I want this to do, right? Because that's going to choose kind of how you architect it and what kind of training you do and sort of what you want the system to pick out. And so you're making some of those decisions up on the front end, and those are all decisions that are relevant to fair use. If you're training an AI, if you're architecting it in a way that you want it to copy the styles of famous artists, that's going to look different than if you're training an AI to just sort of, identify maybe common elements because you're an academic and you want to know, how often do movies have a violence in the first 10 minutes versus the last 30 minutes. Like that, something like that is a little bit more innocuous.
Right. Well, and so that's yeah. The thing that sort of started to jump out to me when you were talking about, well, what is it that we're optimizing when we're or designing the system for, right? The objective setting. It was mostly okay in prior generations. I'll use all of these terms very loosely, but prior generations of AI systems where they were much narrower and smaller in scope. The reason I'm using those terms deliberately here is because the concept that I'm trying to get at is this notion of capability overhang. And I actually don't know who sort of coined it or came up with it, but I've read it in a bunch of places now, and it's really stuck with me, which is this notion that AI systems today have a capability overhang, meaning that there are unexplored and unknown for now facets, capabilities that are latent in these highly generalizable large scale systems that are not necessarily initially designed or forethought or optimized or set for by the people who are building these systems. And they only emerge in these cases, for example, when you put those systems out into the wild and you have, I don't know, like a Discord, a channel where people are going crazy, probing the system in different ways, trying to find out what sort of capabilities are possible, or you have people exchanging tips and tricks on Reddit, etc. And so that's where, some of these things where, what you were talking about, it's not necessarily well articulated or well captured by even the people who are building the systems, even if they're completely transparent, because you have this capability overhang, which is just something that we are only now beginning to explore. And this typically wasn't the problem before because we never had such large scale, internet scale really systems that have been trained on internet scale data and has come with internet scale problems. Anyways, I just wanted to throw that out there as well as a point for consideration.
Can I ask a question for this, maybe more for Greg and Carla? I mentioned earlier that the EU, for its text and data mining exception, has an opt-out for one of their exceptions anyway. Do either of you have any experience or know anyone who's been trying to use this opt-out? And I know also there have been people have been working on systems in the US, although we don't have a formalized opt-out process, but they've been working, we've been reading about like have I been trained, where you can look up whether a particular AI is training on your data. And then also supposedly they're working on a registry for people to opt out. Do you have any experience with these?
I'll answer quickly and then Greg, I'll let you answer as well. I've yet to find any kind of true opt-out system. The have I been trained? I know that they're working on something, but you have to be open about it. One of the things that concerns me about have I been trained is if you check out their about section, they clearly state that they don't, and I'm paraphrasing here, the exact quote, I don't have it in front of me, but they state that they don't believe that copyright law is the way forward. So it does concern me that, an entity that's supposed to work on opt-out tools, and I know that they're working loosely with Stability AI, if I'm not, that might, from my impression of it on Twitter, that's the impression. But one of the things that, so it does concern me that, that's kind of what it is, but also there's no there's nothing that I've seen as of yet. How about you, Greg?
No, sorry, no, not at all. I mean, the one concern that is out there is that you have been thrown out into the bucket, and then you have no option to get out. There's like, okay, just you're like faced to this whole industry, AI, and you have no option right now to just get out of it, just get out of that, and in the first place, there was no question whether you want to get in. I think that's the main concern here, because I would have said no initially, because I want to build my own career, my own name slowly, much slower than that, without that popularity, but consistent and focused on my style, just not replicating any style of any artist, but consistent. And that was not the case here. We were thrown into this new field without any option to get out.
Yeah, but to add two things to that, backtrack really quickly. The MIT report, I think it was the MIT, either MIT or Forbes, one of the two, but they mentioned a person called Steve Henderson. And Steve Henderson is his manager is his wife, and she's been trying to contact Stability AI and a lot of these companies to get her husband's work out of the data sets, and they've yet to contact her back. They've yet to say anything at all. But to kind of also reiterate to what Greg was saying is definitely, yeah, like the concern about this isn't necessarily so much opt-out, is that we were taking the right to opt-in away. And I think personally, as not just as an artist, but as an individual, I really hate that to be a precedent to be set, either where it's, AI generated media or AI generated anything. I think that worries me. With that in mind, I actually kind of, unless Nicole, Rachel, if you guys have any questions, please jump in.
It would just be about the this question of opt out. Is it even really something that we can do at this point? Like, Abi, I mean, that's kind of your expertise. Like, let's say that's best case scenario, we can work towards like an opt out situation, like Carla was kind of mentioning a little bit at the beginning. Like, is that truly ever going to be opt out, or do we have to start from scratch and allow people to, that the data sets are just public domain, and that people can have the right to opt in if they want to, whatever those opt in, whether that's a license, whether, whatever that compensation looks like, but can, the current versions of the data set is an opt out even an option?
So basically, can AI forget? Is that the question?
Well, and I think there's a nuance to the first question and the second question, which is, can AI forget? And I think maybe I'll start with the first one first, because that relates to the data, versus the second one relates to learned representations within the model, which much harder. There is an entire subfield called machine unlearning. In fact, there was a paper published on it. I believe the first paper published on it in 2019. You can fact check me on that. And it's incredibly difficult, just to put that out there. Coming back to the question on opting out of data sets, right? I think when you look at these data sets in the first place, like what do they have in them, right? They have URLs to resources that you go and fetch, right? And so a possible structure is that you go and provide to organization X who's compiled that data set, right? And say, hey, these are my URLs, whatever, blocklist them, don't use them, right? That could be like one potential solution. And I'll get to why that's not effective. It's not effective because you can have duplicates of that existing on, aggregator websites and other places that, do this sort of thing. So sure, you protected your own hosted assets from it, but then those aggregators and other places where copies of that reside, you're still stuck because it'll still pull that in, right? Let's say that the organization that's doing this work has a moral awakening, let's call it. And they're like, okay, we will, provide us hashes of your images or something. And when we pull in, the resource from the URLs that we have, we'll compare it to the hashes and we'll exclude that, right? That could be possible. Even that, I would say, is still problematic because we are able to circumvent those hashes and in a lot of situations, and the provenance for that is when you see your protection measures that are put in places for like CSAM, right? So child sexual and abuse materials, right? So people always try to find because it's an adversarial environment and dynamic, right? So they find ways to circumvent those hashes. So it's an ongoing cat and mouse. So even that has modes of failure. All that said, I would ask the meta question, which is, I think, to going back to the points that you were making, which is that even though some of these organizations have put in place statements saying that, hey, like we want to respect your rights and want to provide you with opt-out mechanisms, all of that stuff, it's one thing to say that, and the other thing to actually put in place sufficient resources to reply to those requests when they come in. That so far we've seen has not been the case. And by the way, I don't know if we explicitly call this out so far, but I think we should, which is that in the case of Stability AI, the investment from them to train the model has been said to be about $600,000 or whatever, right? And as of last week, they've raised a little more than $100 million and have been valued at more than $1 billion. So let's also not forget that significant commercial gains have been made at the expense of people. And the reason I also throw that point out in relation to this is that maybe now is the time that they have a moral awakening and start to put resources behind their statements. But I think both in service of that point and the fact that, hey, they're making, pardon my French, a shit ton of money. And we should call them out on that.
I kind of, yes, Abby. I also kind of want to add on to that too. And it's important for people to remember, I've done a lot of meetings with media already where they, ask me, well, the genie's out of the bag now. And by the way, excuse me if you hear any screaming. I live in a busy street and San Francisco can get wild sometimes. So apologies. But they say often genie's out of the bag, like people can use this now. I think it's important to recognize that, Stability AI, and it's important to call this out too, not only funded these tools, but also had the models released to the public, even though so many ethics, advocates said no. TechCrunch contacted them earlier on concerning, potential for deep fakes and harm. And even I myself had public conversations with the founder being like, hey, there's a lot of concerns artists have. This should not be released to the public anymore. But then Stability AI did release it to the public. And then now we're like, well, we can't do anything about it. It's out there. So that's a point that I think it's important to remember.
No, and Carla, really quickly to add to what you just said, like if you so when we look at Lion 5B, right, the paper that was the sort of genesis when the data set was put out, the first page of that paper in bold text, I kid you not, like you can pull up the paper right now and look at the first page. It says on there, please do not use this because it has known issues of bias and copyright, all of that stuff. It says it in bold first page, right? By the way, paper was accepted, as far as I know, to the NeurIPS datasets and benchmark track. So it is going to be published at the conference, right? And then second, of course, as you already pointed out, which a lot of people did not really pay a lot of attention to, was that, of course, Stability AI, funded the research behind this paper, and hence the data set as well. So when you have these explicit claims that are put there, like what I find a huge intention action gap, right? Where you're saying something and maybe intending for it to be followed, but then basically throwing it out the door at the first like drop of money that you see, oh, like people are interested, this is an opportunity to make money. And so that ethics statement basically goes out the door. I mean, like, I think again, that's something that we need to like seriously also ask questions about. What are acceptable practices for how we compile data sets, who funds them, transparency around them, the seriousness of ethics statements, how we choose to accept these things at conferences for publication. Because these are, by the way, NeurIPS is a top tier ML conference. Like it doesn't get any better. And so what kind of precedent are we setting for future ML research? So anyways, I just wanted to also throw out those points.
I wanted to ask you too, follow up to that. Can we talk more about the non-profit or, non-commercial research used commercially? Is this something that's common in the industry? Is this something that we're seeing that's new? I'm just curious.
Well, I mean, historically, we've always had these sort of research non-commercial data sets, right? And that's done, by the way, with good intentions from people where, and they might have also, by the way, approved, like not in this case, I don't believe, and we might have to check on this, but in a lot of like data compilation efforts where you're working towards compiling a data set, towards creating a new benchmark, etc., that's helped to advance machine learning significantly. Like if you go back to 2012 with ImageNet, the data set, right? Like that sparked the modern deep learning revolution, right? So these data sets benchmarks are fantastic to move state of the art in the field, no doubt. But they always come from a place, and most of the times they'll have like IRB approvals, right? So institutional review board approvals as that work is done, especially when it touches human data. But when you're creating these sorts of benchmarks, large scale public data sets, they're large scale and they're public, which means that basically anybody can go out and use it, right? And if you then choose to build something that then becomes a commercial service, that's where now we're pushing to ask those questions even in the IRB funding phase, saying, hey, if such and such kind of data set is created and released, what kinds of controls are we even meaningfully able to put in place in the first place, right? Because the point, and I'm sorry, I'll yield in a second. I realize like I'm taking up too much space. But when we're talking about like what is meaningful control when you're releasing these systems, it also helps to make the distinction between, especially when we talk about mid-journeys, Dolly 2 and stability or stable diffusion, right? Or Dream Studio. There are some systems that are made available as a gated API, so as a service, right? And some systems which, you release an open source model, which basically means that anybody can take it and create whatever downstream apps and services that they want from it. Especially in the case where you have both releases, right? Which is that you have a democratized version, right? Which is like, and I use democratized version in a very specific context here, meaning that a low barrier to being able to use it, which is through an API. So they've done all the hard work. They've set up a GUI. They've done everything, a graphical user interface. You just go in, you type a prompt, it gives you the images, you're done, and you pay whatever number of cents per image. Makes life easy for people who want to use it. Or you have the open source version, which is harder. You need a few technical chops, set it up, run it on hardware, all of that stuff. The controls that you're able to put in place, the safety filters that you're able to put in place meaningfully, and I'm using the word here deliberately, meaningfully only work in an API as a service gated context. And there's a caveat to that as well. I'll come back to that in a second. These sort of safety filters and API controls basically are non-existent for an open source version. release, right? Because it's an open source version, anyone can do anything with it. By the way, folks have said, well, there were some, controls that were put in place in the open source version as well, and actually those were subverted quite quickly. There were Reddit posts that were going around where people shared code snippets that you could easily disable it with a one-line code change, right? And sorry, I'll conclude with my caveat to the API safety control in a gated as a service version. Those also, again, when combined with the power of Discord channels, Reddit forums, people find ways to circumvent that through proxy prompts, other mechanisms. Anyway, sorry, I went on a sort of long little,
We
rant there.
we asked and we got your expertise. It's fantastic. Nicole, Rachel, or even the panelists themselves, do you guys have any questions for each other or anything at all? I have a ton of questions, but I want to give room for others as well. Or not. Anybody? All
Yeah, I
right.
think
Oh,
we
go
just
ahead.
we do have a lot of questions from the chat, so whenever we're ready for that, but yeah, I'm keeping that updated.
Thank you for that. I think maybe perhaps like if the panelists don't have any kind of particular questions, perhaps we can end it on Greg and ask Greg a question. There's so many things I wish we could speak about, and so many things that I wish we had more time to ask about. But I guess, I mean, if you have any words for artists who are concerned about this, what would it be? What will you tell as the front shining person of all this? Like, what would you have to say about that?
It's really hard to tell right now because I'm
Yeah.
still having myself like huge concerns and lots of questions out there. I would say like just do whatever you do right now and just focus on your work, because whatever is happening outside, like the AI is just we can't do right now as a person, as a one unit. We can't do much right now. We can ask questions. We can form groups of people, ask questions of people that are experienced in that field. But I do have some note or thought about the whole system of AI, how it generates images. Like Abby said, that it's just like one complex form of generating images. But I do like I found the really cool example on the internet where whenever you created an image without artist name, it provided you like decent results. But whenever you type in some artist name, it gave you much better results. So there is like one really huge issue with that artists provide lots of quality to this AI just with one name, not just my name, but any other artist's name. And I think like, in this field, like I know AI is really helpful in any other field, but in this field, we should really really focus on artists like heritage and their portfolios and their names and identity, basically, because we formed that over the years, and then suddenly someone is just typing their names into this machinery, and there is like really cool results, and suddenly, okay, I have like great results with just typing one word or just two words or three artists combined. So in combining it with available public domain artists out there, like my question is why they didn't do that before, and what we can do right now to just we like Abby said, it's probably impossible to just reverse that, because AI can't forget, but it's still a problem, and still we had on the plate like public domain and living artists, which struggle to get through their career and things like that. So That's
Thank
just my thought.
Those are good thoughts. Thank you. All right. Anybody else at the panelist have any parting? That's a good way to kind of jump into Q&A, perhaps. Any parting thoughts or any questions? Any last hurrahs before we open the floodgates to chat?
No, I think there's some really good questions in the, that people have sent in that will
Awesome.
kind of create kind of jumping off points. I'm just, the one that was kind of interesting to me, and she actually has her hand raised, is Kristen, with regards to an idea around some sort of, this concept of like, are these AI models doing these like straight up copies? Which we kind of know a little bit that, with the bloodborne example that Carla provided. Is there a way that we could do some sort of invisible watermark technology, and how could that be kind of brought into enforcement? Is that something that anyone here could see as being a solution for, just direct, like, hey, yeah, that is a very clear way of saying you stole my work? Any thoughts? I thought it was an interesting, way of like, I personally thought that was a very interesting way of like trying to combat some of that. But
as I understand it, invisible watermarks are already being used in these AI systems, but I don't know exactly what information is being encoded in them. The purpose of it, as the developers said, was that it was to prevent future AI systems from retraining, from training on AI generated work, because you get this kind of breakdown, you get more noise to signal when you do that. And of course, now that stability is open source, people are finding ways to strip out that watermark. And so, a bunch of people are mad about that. But what I find interesting is that you could encode potentially the whole prompt in an image, and then have a different detector every time you try to upload something to any main website that can detect, whether or not a certain name was invoked, or just whether or not it's AI at all. And so I just was curious if anybody had anything to say on that, whether we might end up with a sort of cat and mouse game going on with the watermarking stuff.
I mean, I can quickly jump in, and sorry, I forgot the name of the person who just spoke. But that's a great point on invisible watermarks. There was also a sort of related technique that was put out, I think 3 or 4 years ago, maybe at this point, or 3 years ago. Pandemic, everything is like all blurred together. It was this concept of radioactive data, and it was a similar concept where they applied shifts to data within a data set, and were able to detect if a machine learning system had actually trained on that, and even if, I think I'm remembering this, if I'm remembering this correctly, if the inferences that were generated from the system actually ended up relying on some of those radioactively marked instances of data within that data set. So it's certainly an interesting concept. And to, I think, directly answer your question, a lot of work in media integrity today is fighting against exactly that issue, which is that it's always going to be an adversarial dynamic between the folks who are trying to defend and then the folks who are trying to attack, right? So it's a huge like topic in the media integrity space, from which we can draw lessons, I guess, is the reason I bring it up.
Thank you. I'd like to ask a question. One of our audience member, Audrey Gonzalez, asks, how can the Copyright Office know the difference between AI generated images and one created by an artist? Second question, that is, and what proofs, if any, are required to prove that enough has been contributed by a human to claim authorship?
Mark, you want to take this one?
I knew Andrew was going to do that, actually.
I can try if you want.
No, it's fine. So, I mean, so the pragmatic answer is, the Copyright Office is a government agency. We, like all government agencies, are, we can only do what we can with the resources we have. And so when we examine a copyright application, we are really examining sort of, that everything makes sense and everything sort of fits the broad definitions of what is protected under the Copyright Act. And so the simple answer is, if you lie to the Copyright Office, we might know you were lying or we might not, but it is generally a bad idea to lie to the government. It is not something we encourage you to do. Please do not do it. And if we find out, we can come back and cancel your registration if that lie is the only reason we granted it. So our general advice is that, like, we talk to everyone who comes in to apply. Like, if you have questions about, do I have enough here as a human to claim some sort of copyright interest, you can just tell us. Like, we ask for sort of as much information as you can provide about what did you do, what did you make, what sort of are you claiming to have created? And if it seems like there's some AI work being done, but some human work being done, we can talk with you about that to figure out exactly, under our understanding of the law, what is exactly within the scope of what can be protected by copyright. So the simple answer is just talk to us. But generally, we do not encourage people to lie to us.
That seems fair. Nicole, Rachel, any questions? We have a lot of questions, but
Nicole?
Yeah, so I guess, well, part of me, Ben, you've had your hand raised so patiently for so long. Ben, please go ahead and ask us your question, please.
Is that me? Sorry,
Yes,
I
that's
wasn't.
you. Sorry, I should have said yes. There's lots of Bens. Ben's in, Ben's out.
Thank you. I really appreciate being able to speak to you, all of you guys. I'm a professor at University of Chicago, and we've actually been working in this space primarily from the privacy protection standpoint. 2 years ago, we developed a tool that's been, I think, downloaded about 1 million copies worldwide, that protects human faces from unauthorized model corruption and training in the scheme of facial recognition. And so, the idea is you modify your own images so that they cannot be used to train a model against you without your knowledge. So one of the things that we're actually interested in right now is actually working in the space of looking at diffusion models, particularly to protect artists, actually. My students and I were already working in this space and trying to find ways to better understand the space and the damage being done, when Sean, he's up here and actually found this particular meeting, which was super helpful. So one of the key questions that I had for all of you guys to start is, I'd like to know, from the perspective of artists, what would be the desired outcome? Because obviously harm is being done, and whether copyright takes care of it or not. But let's say that you had a tool that was able to, that you could apply to your own art so that when distributed, it could not be used effectively to capture your style in a generator like Midjourney, like DALL-E 2, like whatever future models come up. What would be the desired outcome? Should it be generate, for example, garbage that looked like it could not possibly be usable art? Could it be, do you want it to generate art that distinctively lost the style that you associate with your own piece of art and therefore lose that particular association, but perhaps still be useful? Or would you rather have something else completely different? Perhaps, you guys would like a more cooperative role with the model. So a more radioactive model, for example, you could track how much of your art was trained into the model, and so much, therefore, how much profit or how much, remuneration the model could then be headed back to you. So that would be my primary question, would be to understand what the community would like to see be the ideal outcome.
Greg, do you want to get started? I have a lot of thoughts on that for sure.
Okay, so I can start. I mean, in my opinion, like watermarks or any kind of like tracking, the amount of our works, original works into, in the AI generated art is like not the best idea. I think we should get to the source. I mean, because technology will grow, will be better and better, and we will still come up with different solutions like watermarks. There will be like tool to avoid that. There is a tool in the I think it's a plugin in Photoshop to just erase the watermark. So there will be always a way to avoid the digital ownership. I think we should get to the source and start looking at the companies that are developing this technology, because without any sort of work around that, we can get to the point where someone will take a name of an artist, produce an art with AI generators, and take the rates of the artists that have been working for many years to get to the point in the industry to charge for their work, that and that. And AI generators probably will get better over the next year or two, and it's already much better than 2 months ago. And there's still like group of people that start selling that on Shutterstock or different website that you can monetize your AI art. And we'll get to the point where probably AI artists or AI users will profit from taking artist's name and his fame or style or expertise, and to just monetize their work and to raise their rates. So I think we should get to the source and just look thoroughly what companies, AI companies are doing and what technology is they are developing. So yeah, that's my point of view.
Yeah, it's quite good. By the way, thank you so much, Ben. That's a fantastic question, and thank you for the work that y'all do. I think privacy is also a huge, big question here as well, because I think it's not only an issue of artists, but it's also an issue for privacy. I do want to be a bit of a troll here and say I would love a tool that, like, if someone wrote my name and made a prompt, like garbage came out, like just bananas or some weird stuff, like they're like, what the heck? But my more serious answer is I feel like I completely agree with Greg. I think we have to hold companies who do this accountable, because otherwise that just opens the door for bad practices to be normalized, and that opens the door for a lot of issues in the future. But in terms of like tools, what I would say is we are going to need a lot of really good tools and databases, or anything that'll help us to figure out, is something AI generated, and figure out what was used to generate that image. Those two things I think will be not only immensely useful to artists, but also immensely useful to the public. A big question in all of this that really we haven't discussed much about is, what do we do when something like election season comes off, and then we have a lot of like crazy imagery of candidates doing things we never imagined, and we don't know that this is like AI generated imagery, like the tools are getting that good. So I think any kind of tool set or any kind of thing that allows people to know what is behind these AI generated images, what is in the databases, will be incredibly, incredibly important. To add even more to that, I think, and this isn't the Copyright Office like wheelhouse, so don't ask them about this, because this is general government in general, but legislation I think will need to be placed for some form of transparency within data sets to occur, or some form of government regulatory body that will look at data sets and say, okay, this AI model has not been trained upon with copyrighted data, has not been trained upon with private data, and so on. Or at least those are my thoughts on it. But damn, thank you so much for your question. How are we doing? We're doing good.
Yeah, we've got a lot of time still. There's I want to kind of talk a little bit about the AI, one of the kind of questions that comes up from people, from artists that are like, oh, I'm not worried about these AI models, you know, the artwork is, you know, so-so. You know, one of the, you know, I'm not really worried about it kind of coming from my job just yet. You know, I've seen what's coming out. In the short period of time that these AI models have existed, like they're already getting better, right? Like now, if we were able to say, you know, scrap the current, you know, the existing AI models and start this new, you know, potential opt-in, do you think they would still have the ability to continue to get better, or will they have to start over from scratch again? Like, are they still going to be as good, basically, or is it going to be starting from ground zero again? Will they ever be able to be as good if people aren't opting into them?
If people didn't opt, well, first I think that's just it seems so infeasible, it's so difficult to imagine, which I think is a real failure, right? To the point that Greg was making earlier, which is that we really need to get to the source of the problem, right? But then to answer your question, I think we're also making significant algorithmic advances that are helping to increase capabilities of these systems. So it's really hard to say anything that will hold even in 12 months from now is essentially sort of where I've landed seeing advances happen this year, where as a practitioner, things that I didn't imagine would be possible are suddenly just happening at such a quick pace. And I think one underappreciated element of this, which I believe deserves a fair amount of attention as well, is how we're exposing these systems for consumption and for almost co-development. And I'll quickly sort of summarize what I mean by that. One part of it is that notion of capability overhang, especially for large generalized systems, which you now, through mechanisms like making a mid-journey system available as a Discord bot, means that you're able to rapidly explore with partner intelligences, which are us, the humans, who are able to probe and extract new pieces of capabilities from these systems, which prior we did not even know existed, right? So, and when we're thinking about like sort of what these mechanisms are, so Discord chatbot is one. You can even, like, I saw this evolution happen earlier in the summer when Dolly, so OpenAI had created an Instagram account, and they used to, like, you could DM them a prompt, and then if you were so lucky, they would pick your prompt and they would generate the image and share it as a part of their Instagram stories, right? I noticed a significant improvement over time as people were interacting with that account, because people saw what the system was capable of, and then they, as humans, were improving in the kinds of prompts that they were providing. So there was a co-learning, co-evolution that was happening there. And so the reason I bring all of this up is that the advances in system capabilities are not just purely from a data standpoint, they're not just purely from an algorithmic standpoint either, but they're also from the perspective of how these systems are deployed and exposed for consumption. And those mechanisms also have a role to play. And so I think we need to be paying attention to all of those things as surfaces for implementing controls, as surfaces for implementing, or as surfaces that serve as targets for governance as well. So anyways, that's, I think maybe it doesn't directly answer the question that you raised, but hopefully.
No, but it is interesting, because it's not, like you say, it's not just about the data sets. As the technology exists and people are learning about it, they can build their model differently next time, learn based on what they've learned on these previous ones. So that's really interesting and helpful to know. Again, it's so hard. There's so many great questions in here. One of the things that kind of comes up time again, especially within our community, and Stability AI kind of already kind of shot themselves in the foot a little bit with this, with the disco diffusion, to be like, well, we're not going to touch the music industry because that's a problem. Like, why is it that the visual, like, is there, from a copyright standpoint, like, why does the visual arts kind of get left out from these conversations? Like the music industry, you know, no one wants to mess with the music industry. They want to make sure that it's kind of, you know, done right. Like, why do you think the AI community have given more consideration to the music industry over visual arts? Is there historical precedence of just artists not really fighting these battles, whereas the music industry does?
I'm not sure how much I can say on this. I mean, from a legal perspective, there's not a particular difference between visual arts and music. I suspect some of that may actually be technological, where it's just harder to make a randomly generated song that sounds good. There may be something more intrinsic about that, but from a legal perspective, there's not really a legal distinction.
There is a robot that they've trained to write songs. I've just watched a video on YouTube. I forget what it's called, Shimon, I think. So
I just still remember the Daddy's Car song that came out like a year or two ago that was terrible. So maybe that technology has improved, but it certainly was bad 2 years ago.
There are some pretty good AI music bots at this point, and it's going to get better. I mean, it really is just a matter of time. I think you've all probably seen, even within sort of the same like visual art space, like there are now like movie creation AIs, and I think it's mostly a matter of time with that. But from a legal perspective, as Mark said, there's not really a distinction that would be significant here, except maybe in the sense that music typically has more copyright owners than a particular piece of art does. So like that, you just may have
it's just easier.
You may just have a larger number of people invested as well, but again, legally not a significant distinction.
And then a couple of people have asked, like 7 people have asked, if it was possible for a copyright office to define style.
That sounds like less of a legal question and more of an artistic question, and we are unfortunately only lawyers, so I don't think that's something we can define quite easily here.
I might ask though, expression, is that something, because I've seen that used as well?
So expression is a term of art. In copyright, it just means sort of the specific thing you made. So, you know, if you write a book, the words in the book are the expression, whereas like the idea is just the concept. So I mean, it's a term of art that just means kind of the corpus or the thing that you actually created, the work as it exists. Not necessarily sort of like I am expressing myself or I have freedom of expression. It's not quite that kind of expression. It's more of a legal term.
Thank you.
Yeah, so I do want to call on some of these hands. USCF, you've had your hand raised for quite a while. If you wanted to share your question.
Thank you, Carla. So my question is, it's of 2 parts. Software engineer named Matthias Bullman was able to utilize Stable Diffusion as a compression decompression tool. My question is, okay, first one, if Stable Diffusion can be used in this way, does it logically follow that one could faithfully recreate the images in the training data in near one-to-one representations using the right prompts? And 2, if this premise is true, does it poke holes in the argument that AI created images are transformative enough for fair use?
Who wants to answer that one?
Well, I can answer the first part because I'll defer on the fair use stuff to the people who actually know that. I just basically soaked up your knowledge on fair use, so I will defer on that. So in one-to-one regurgitations, I actually don't know of an empirical study for visual outputs, but I do know of empirical studies in text outputs where basically thinking about GPT-3 systems, they are able to spit out verbatim pieces of text. In fact, even for code generation models, so like software code, right? Those models, now we've had a case filed against GitHub Copilot. I think, Carla, you already mentioned that in your presentation, but I think that happened like 2 weeks ago or maybe last week. And those are places where we are seeing. So, and by the way, if the person who asked the question, if you're interested, Nicolas Papernaut from University of Toronto actually has it's from his paper where he's demonstrated that as you scale up models with larger data sets, they did an empirical like analysis showing like the likelihood of getting verbatim one-to-one outputs goes up, and like I would encourage you to check out that paper because I'm probably butchering like a ton of what is said in that paper, and it was a while ago that I read it. So, but anyways, if you search for Nicholas Papernaut, University of Toronto, he was the one who made that empirical analysis comparing different generations of GPT-3 models to articulate how the likelihood increases as the model sizes change. Yeah.
Thank
And then
you.
I'll turn it over to Mark and
Wow.
Andrew.
Sure. On the fair use side, as Mark mentioned earlier, so many fair use arguments have to do with the framing of what the use is. In this case, I have a hard time seeing how the mere fact that, or at least I am skeptical that the mere fact that a particular AI tool could, if given a sufficiently like distinctive prompt, reproduce a work exactly, would totally tilt the analysis, would prove definitive in some way. If I offer a hypothetical, again, totally hypothetical, we don't have case law on this at this point. But if you can imagine that if you were training, say, natural language processor, like a novel writing AI, and this AI was trained on any number of novels, the mere fact that it could the AI could theoretically reproduce some existing copyrighted novel probably wouldn't change the fact that at a sufficient level, we're going to frame this case as, hey, I've copied these different works, but I've created this highly transformative novel writing machine. That would be an argument anyway. Then backing up from transformative use, just when it comes to this is not strictly a transformative use issue, but when we think in copyright world about examining new technologies, we often ask whether they have a substantial non-infringing use. So one additional layer here, it's not, again, not an exclusive layer with respect to the fair use question, but you might say, like, listen, there are potential infringing uses for this technology, but there are also substantial non-infringing uses for the technology. Mark, do you want to add anything?
Yeah, I guess the thing is, so usually when we talk about copyright infringement in AI, the sort of main ways that breaks down is kind of the inflow of works from training, and then the outflow of works if you're generating some sort of artistic work. And so we usually treat those as kind of different questions because from a fair use perspective, they're a bit different. So if you could imagine maybe the ability to essentially recreate an image or a piece of the training data through a prompt, that's a question for whether the output is infringing. There's a lot of other questions around the output, like who would you sue? There's no answer to that question. A lot of people ask us that question. I have no answers for you today. But that's not necessarily going to affect whether sort of creating a general purpose machine that you at the time did not realize could spit out training data one-to-one. That's going to be those are going to be two separate questions.
Okay, thank you. Could I ask one more question if we have time?
I'm so sorry. We have so many questions, but thank you.
Okay, thank you.
I was so generous. I'm like, yes, please. I'm like, oh no, I'm sorry. They're keeping track of the questions. My bad.
Let's go to Xavier. You had your hand raised.
Hi, can everyone hear me?
Yes.
Okay, so the question that I have, because on the topic of these image sets, I mean, like just how fast it's improving and how that may not make much of a difference if like it was just copyrighted free and public domain data only. So another idea that I kind of have had obsessed over for a while is the idea of like, would there be a possibility of like limiting the amount of images these systems would have, like perhaps on like a yearly basis, and they would have to like, after like every single year, they have to like get rid of the images that they were trained on and then like proceed to get newer ones. I don't know if that's even feasible, but that's just like a question that's been like burning in the back of my head. Like it just so, artists who like to do things, with traditionally don't get like completely supplanted. And that's like a big fear that I have. So I'm not sure how if that something like that would even be possible. But I'll stop before I just rant on. Thank you.
Who's gonna take this one?
I mean, I guess I'm happy to. So, sorry, if I understand the question correctly, is what we're trying to say is to support artists, we want to remove a certain subset of images from the training of AI systems to give them a fighting chance. Like, am I like misunderstanding the question here completely?
Yeah, sorry. I'll make it simpler. Is there a possibility to just limit the amount these images have? Like, is there a possibility was that even a possibility? Can they be limited? Sorry, I'll let you answer.
Limited how?
Like just in the amount, like, so rather than like them just having free reign to just have like billions of images, could there possibly be like a limit, like say like only like 1 million or so, rather than like the billions of images that they just have free
I'm
reign to use?
sure they have the ability to build this model however they want. This is how they've chosen to build it, right? So yeah, of course they did that with disco diffusion before they made the decision to
Dance diffusion.
Dance diffusion. I don't keep saying disco diffusion. I'm like dance diffusion, so yeah, they absolutely have the ability to build these models however they want to. But they're making choices to do it in very specific ways. So yeah, and that's it for me as a non-AI person, non-artist, non-lawyer, just what my understanding is of what I've read and how these AI models are being built.
We have a couple of questions. Oh, sorry, Carla.
I do want to, Avi, if you have more to follow up on that, I also this kind of spurs another question for me about what is actually the importance of a data set to machine learning?
It's of prime importance. That's the simplest answer. Without it, it's nothing, right?
Does it need billions of, does it need all that? I guess.
So the current paradigm does require that, though what we're seeing is also subfields of machine learning that are trying to do similar things using fewer data points. But thus far, the most impressive results still continue to come from the largest of models, which require the largest of data sets.
So in order for it to be as effective as it has currently, yes, it does need to have these billions of images in it. So while they could build one with a lesser amount of images, we don't really know well, maybe you do, like what the effectiveness of that would be, or someone with better knowledge, not you. I put you on the spot. Do you, Arby? No, but you know what I'm saying? Like, yes, there is.
No, yeah, by the way, like we have now, there's a constant battle also where, people are trying to prove their technical chops by putting out models that use like an order of magnitude data less and achieve like comparable performance, because of course that is something that is a technical and impressive engineering and algorithmic achievement. That said, though, if we put it very simply, in the current market structure, if you're someone who's trying to sell your services and trying to compete, having a larger model just continues to give you an edge in terms of the quality of outputs that you're getting. And yes, of course, that comes with a caveat that there are people who are attempting to do this with smaller model sizes, even with the perspective of like trying to be able to deploy them on edge devices, right? So, smaller, resource constrained devices. But if you're someone who's like, you're building a new company, company X, and you want to expose an API and you want to attract people to switch over from Midjourney or Stable Diffusion or whatever, forget all the, questions around ethics and everything else. It's just purely trying to compete on just getting better, higher quality outputs. Your most likely bet to succeed is going for something even bigger. And that's an unfortunate state of affairs.
And but sorry to interrupt, could I make my position, or like, can I just like comment what my question was like clearly trying to ask?
I'm so sorry. We're just really like, I'm just trying to get through just a couple more questions.
Yeah.
But
Okay, I apologize. I'll let
No
this go.
worries.
I'm sorry.
No, you're fine. You're fine.
I will say that, you know, we will, I can't speak to everybody on the panel, but if there are kind of questions or, you know, concerns, like everyone here is a pretty open person in terms of, yeah, when it's been possible to get to all the questions. That being said, while we're kind of, you know, we've got 5 minutes left, we were going to go till 2. Bill L had a question about, you know, with regards to movements, like what can we do? Well, anyone that's here listening today is probably concerned, you know, in some way or another. So that his question was, you know, are there any movements, you know, or efforts to protect artists' work, and or to accumulate funding to assist in, you know, just kind of helping artists? I guess from the copyright standpoint, you know, I'm just going to like ask you guys, do you guys know of any organizations that people can reach out to? You know, I'm going to say Concept Association is one of those resources. You know, where you know, this is an issue that we care about, not just from a copyright standpoint, but from protecting the future of the kind of creative industries. So, you know, we've been having some really great conversations with folks in Washington to hopefully try and help with some policy and some legislation. And we're going to be starting a GoFundMe really soon. So that's kind of something that we're doing on our side. But Copyright Office, do you guys know of any organizations that people can kind of reach out to with any concerns they might have as an artist?
So I don't know how much we can refer to specific groups, except to say that there are, I believe, volunteer awards for the arts associations in most states. In addition, I can emphasize that the Copyright Office itself, we listen to stakeholders. So if some people have concerns, they should feel free to bring those concerns to us. So Mark, anything to add to that?
I think that's about all we can really say. I mean, we're always happy to hear from the public. You know, there are groups, I think, out there that are starting to ask some of these questions, but in general, given the fact that we are sometimes the people being advocated towards, we don't have a lot of involvement in sort of the advocacy side. So I think that's about all we can say.
And just from the chat, we do have Minta Carlson from the Archimedes Institute, which is one such organization, Joshua at Numinous, who's also part of an effort. So Joshua, I know that you've been, what is the name of your organization?
Hi, yeah, I'm actually with Minta, also part of Archimedes.
Perfect.
Yeah,
great. And Archimedes Institute is founded by artists. It's an organization that we'll be working with as well. So stay tuned with them and follow them as well. And if you are not subscribed to our newsletter, all of our efforts and future town hall things are going to be on Consumer Association's newsletter, and we'll be communicating the policy work as it evolves as well there.
I'd like to also add just a little bit more to that. Like, I know that there's a lot of big questions and a lot of fear and a lot of anxiety on this. What I would tell people is, you know, organizing efforts do take time. So I'm sure in time we'll start seeing what this actually looks like in terms of how we as artists can have our voice and our work and our rights advocated for. But in the meantime, being as educated as possible, reading as much on this, learning as much as we can on this is going to be really, really, really helpful to us. So thank you for attending things like these meant to help engage with that. Nicole, Rachel, do we have anything last before we close this off and allow our panelists to get a final statement, even if it's just like a goodbye or something?
I just want to reiterate, there's a number of copyright questions in the chat that artists have. Unfortunately, we weren't able to get to a lot of them, but from what I'm hearing from you guys is that you know, the people can, you know, the Copyright Office is a very approachable government agency, so that, you know, this would not necessarily be considered the only forum in which someone could kind of ask these types of questions. Like if someone has a question with pertains to artists' rights and copyright, where can folks go to ask those questions? Can they tweet?
We have no, do not tweet at me, please. No, so we have a public information
Please
office.
don't tweet at me.
I you know, it's under new ownership. I'm good. So we do have a public information office that can handle a lot of sort of public facing inquiries. It really depends on what the question is. We don't offer legal advice. So if the question is, this artist, you know, someone used this AI to generate this image, is this infringing? We are probably not going to be able to help you with it. If you have sort of general policy questions like, you know, I as an artist am worried about, you know, the implications of this specific technology or that technology, we are always in listening mode. We're happy to get those sorts of comments. Again, the best place to start with is really, I think it's on the contact page of our website on copyright.gov. But, you know, it will, if it needs to get to, you know, me or Andrew, it will filter its way through, and
that's perfect. No, that's great, because
I think that, thank you so much for your time with that. And we just really wanted Greg, you have been patiently listening and observing. We would love for you to do kind of a closing remark or any kind of, any thoughts that you might have had since you last spoke.
Wait, really quickly, should we go with the other ones really quick and then leave Greg for last?
Sure. Yeah, I just want to be my full time.
Greg, we're leaving you for last. No pressure whatsoever.
That gives him some time, though. Gives him some time. Yeah.
Think about it. So, any closing statement, Andrew, Mark, Abby, anyone who'd like to just, you know.
I can start. I mean, I'll just say I think we need to hold people accountable. And I can't emphasize that enough. I think I said that in the last town hall as well. It's still people behind these AI systems, and they are making deliberate, intentional choices. And let's not forget. And I'm not saying that as a person who builds AI systems that don't look at the AI systems, they're fine. I'm not saying that, but all I'm trying to say is that let's be very deliberate in our efforts and actually hold people accountable, those who are behind these systems and who stand to benefit from them.
Andrew, Mark.
Sure. I'll just thank Carla. I'll thank you again for inviting us. As Mark said, we're here in listening mode. We are very eager to hear what everyone is like, the experience that Greg has had and what people's concerns are. And if you have any further questions or concerns you'd like to raise, as Mark said, you can reach the Copyright Office's Public Information Office through the webpage.
I think my closing remark is going to be a bit counterintuitive. So, obviously there's a lot of interest in the copyright aspects of a lot of the issues we've discussed today. But I think, as we've also discussed, copyright law is never going to be the solution to all AI issues. There are privacy issues, there are civil rights issues. There are instances where maybe the thing that we're worried about is not really the sort of things that copyright law is built to worry about. And so, there are other agencies looking at these issues. The Federal Trade Commission has started thinking about, what is the penalty for using data that you've not consented to build facial recognition models. And so, to the extent that you're worried about copyright issues, obviously, we are here to listen to those questions, but, certainly don't be afraid to talk to other government agencies like the FTC. They are also thinking through these questions, and they have a lot of expertise that Andrew and I don't, that are relevant here too.
That sounds like Town Hall 3.
That's exactly where my head went. We're just gonna.
Sorry.
Yeah,
maybe
no,
I shouldn't announce that publicly, but so we'll see. Thank you, Mark. Thank you, Andrew. Thank you, Avi. And Greg, you want to give us the last word on?
Yeah, one thing that AI showed us lately was that identity is like something that was not measured before. I mean, right now we can see that, that's what we've been working for many years. Our identity as an artist right now can be forged really easily with AI, and probably will be much easier in the next few years. So I think that, our beings in the internet, and basically identity, our artistic identity should be they can consider into the future. Basically, we should really look into it.
Well, thank you so much, Greg. Well, with that said, I really want to give another round of applause, or at least a small one, to our guest. Thank you so much, Greg, Mark, Andrew, Abhishek, for your time and expertise and thoughts. It was invaluable to me, and I'm sure the community. Thank you so much, Nicole and Rachel from the Concept Art Association, for hosting and helping organize this town hall as well. And Rachel, do you have anything else you'd like to say?
No,
before
I
we
think
end?
as before, this will go up on our YouTube channel.
Mhm.
Stay educated, stay informed, chat with your peers. We're having some graphics being made right now that we're going to be shareable, going over a lot of the stuff that we talked about today, just facts. Those are kind of small ways that you guys can kind of help towards the movement. You don't have to have tons of funds, just educate your peers, and yeah, just stay informed. And then also more like just stay passionate about creating art. Like, don't let this be like the doom and gloom of it all. Like, we can work through this. We're showing right now that we're coming together as a community. We don't have to be historically that group that has never done anything about it. We're doing so, believe that we're doing something about it. We're having these conversations with lots of different people. So yeah, that's it. I'm going to end the meeting. This is going to go up on YouTube. And thanks for everyone for coming.
Thank you all so much.
Bye. Bye.